This is the Canadian Foreign Policy Hour. I'm Eve Engler. I'm coming to you from Jojage, which has long been a meeting place of various First Nations, otherwise known as Montreal. I apologize for last week. Um, I don't know what exactly happened to cut me off about I got three quarters, 80% of the way through the notes I prepared. I think the Wi-Fi just went down in the Saskatoon airport. I couldn't get back on for the next like 15 minutes. So yeah, anyways, I apologize for that. Hopefully the Wi-Fi will be stronger here at my place. So yeah, the foreign policy hour, we're at about 110, 115 or something like that. Weekly episodes, critical look at Canada's role abroad. There are many developments in Canadian foreign policy, so I think I'll get right to it. The There's a study shows biggest fires have grown more intense. So the forest fires we've been seeing in many places in the world are getting more intense because of climate disturbances. And then the front page of the business section, I think of Tuesday or Wednesday's Globe Mail, was titled Alberta Energy Sector Grows. Province's energy regulator says oil and gas industry expanded in 2023, a trend likely to continue as global prices rise. So lots of profits to be made in extracting that highly carbon intensive tar sands oil, no matter what happens around the world. The NDP Premier Wab Kinew had a post yesterday or the day before on his X account, Twitter account, where he's boasting about how Manitoba has the lowest gas tax in the country because he had cut the gas tax. And it's apparently this is supposed to be a progressive thing to do to have taxpayers subsidize all roads, not even have the gas tax cover. Taxpayers are, of course, already subsidized most roads, be it through municipal taxes, different federal and provincial allocations to roads. Some of that has been at different periods in time covered by gas taxes. But here you have a NDP premier boasting about cutting the gas tax so we can ensure that private automobiles are even more subsidized on our roads as we move towards ever more damaging climate disturbances. First Quantum, Canadian Vancouver-based company, big mining company, they just announced that they are pursuing their suit against Panama for what will be $20 billion. $20 billion in international tribunal because the Panamanian government said that their operations violated the Panamanian Constitution. So Vancouver companies taken them to international tribunal and they're seeking $20 billion. That's an incredible sum of money for a country like Panama if they were to lose the suit. But this is obviously a big pattern in Canadian mining companies suing governments around the world for lost profits in international tribunals. And that's a big part of what the Canadian government does to support mining companies around the world is they sign these either the FIPAs, the Foreign Investment Promotion Protection Agreements, or via the trade agreements, they include what was called Chapter 11 in NAFTA, basically ability to sue local companies for lost profits in international tribunal. And that very much serves Canadian mining companies' interests, protects them, gives them one more tool to protect their interests in international exploitation. Yesterday was Congo's Independence Day, and Jeffrey York, the Globe Mail reporter based in South Africa, had a post about it and about Lumumba and what happened to Lumumba, Patrice Lumumba, the independence leader. And of course, he didn't say anything about Canada's role in Lumumba's demise, which was a very significant role. Canada was the third biggest player in Lumumba's demise. Um, the other part I think about Congolese independence is worth noting is that there was a Canadian, William Stairs, who still has a street named after him in Halifax and plaque at Royal Military College in Kingston. He was the one who conquered the Katanga region on behalf of King Leopold II, the Belgian king that operated incredibly brutal personal colony for about I think a bit over a decade, and then it became Belgian colony. Um, so that's part of a background. And I go in my Canada Africa book. The Canadian missionaries played a big role in the Congo. They supported King Leopold in the early 1900s with the brutal rubber extraction process. And Canadian later decades, Canada supported Belgian colonial rule, provided weapons through NATO Mutual Assistance Program in the 1950s to Belgium while they were suppressing independence in the Congo, and on and on and on. So I think it is important, first of all, just to mention Congo's independence celebration, but also that Canada has a hand in destroying its independence aspirations with Lumumba, and also in its colonization. The Globe had a piece, Jeffrey York, Wednesday or Thursday, says headline: Kenyan crackdown marks setback for Western strategy in Africa. People probably saw that there, I think the final number is something like 30 people were killed in, I think principally in Nairobi, in this crackdown because of this protest against this tax reform that was being pushed by the IMF in Kenya. Just on a personal note, I was just in Nairobi, so all the images, and Nairobi is actually quite a nice. The center of Nairobi is quite a nice place. I've been there. I guess I've been there 3 times, but I've been there twice for a sort of extended period, just including in January. And it's quite fascinating to see the protest where I wandered around there multiple days. Very nice center of the city. And very walkable and dynamic kind of place. But yeah, so there's huge killings that took place, huge repression, and it's really embarrassing. Not only because this is another kind of IMF riot against government following IMF dictates, which is a long history of that, and Canada for a long time promoted these IMF structural adjustment programs that spurred these riots around, particularly in Africa, but elsewhere, that are often very deadly. So it's another example of that history. But the other thing is that, of course, that Kenya is leading this mission. So right at the same time that Kenyan police were dispatched to Haiti, you have this huge uprising in Kenya, and the Kenyan police killing lots of people. And from what I'm understanding, no one's claiming that there was anything but unarmed. I think they were militant, they were aggressive. The protesters, they did storm Parliament, but I don't think anyone's really claiming that they were armed with guns or knives or anything that was really sort of threatening to the police. Maybe they were chucking some stuff and the like. But so this is quite a brutal crackdown. And here you have the same time, as Jeffrey York points out, Canada's putting $80 million into this Kenyan mission into Haiti. And so this looks quite, and the Americans made Kenya their they call it a strategic non-NATO ally. It's a special status, and they're basically really turning Kenya into one of their kind of principal allies, the current Kenyan government's principal ally on the African continent. There was a coup in Bolivia. The head of the military moved against the leftist President Luis Arce. And this is now it's getting into some interesting territory. It was a failed coup. It lasted 3 hours, 4 hours. Pretty much every country, every in the hemisphere, European Union, Russia, Spain, they all quickly condemned the coup attempt. The Trudeau government didn't. The Trudeau government didn't make any statement. Melanie Joly, as far as I know, still has not made any statement. One of the foreign affairs Twitter accounts made a statement about 24 hours after it, and after literally every country. The Americans' initial statement was quite vague, and so Canada seemed to be following the U.S. statement. And there's of course a background to this, where Canada backed a coup in Bolivia 4 years ago now, 2019, against Evo Morales, and then backed this replacement government that refused to hold elections. There was quite a bit of killing. Dozens of people were killed. And finally, the social movements forced an election, and then Evo Morales' party won overwhelmingly. So Canada's a very slow response, not until the coup has been long after it was reversed, making a statement. Now, it appears that Evo Morales, who was in a dispute while they're both from the same political party, and he was formerly the finance minister of Morales, Arce, the current president, that they've fallen out, and there's been growing disputes between Morales and him, and Morales says he's going to run against him. And the head of the military, who instigated this coup effort, it seems, had said that he was going to do everything he could to block Morales. And then Arce was deposing him because of that. And then there's the coup effort. Now, subsequently, the head of the coup said that he was basically a auto golpe, a self coup, and that the president did it for his own political reasons. And now apparently Morales is sort of suggesting there may be even some truth to this. It's a little bit unclear to me where this is all going, and what's true and what's not true. But I think most important from a Canadian perspective is that the Canadian government sort of didn't seem to, that it followed dozens of other countries in condemning what had taken place, speaks to the fact that the Canadian government, I think, would have been okay with the ouster of a leader from a political party that is viewed as a nationalistic, socialistic, and that fits within a pattern of Canadian policy. I think that one of the parallels with in 2002, in April 2002, when Hugo Chavez was ousted in what turned into a 48-hour coup, the Canadian government basically just stayed quiet until it all kind of unfolded and then was reversed. And that, I think, was because they were basically sympathetic to the coup. And so I think the same dynamic may have been played out here recently in Bolivia. On the note of coups, there's another development in Central America that's connected to a Canadian-backed coup, which is the fact that Juan Orlando Hernandez, Joe, as he's understood in Honduras, the former president, he was sentenced to 45 years by a U.S. New York Southern District Court, and 45 years for drug trafficking and other crimes. And he was president, I believe, until 2022, until Hernandez, he comes to power in the aftermath of 2009 coup against Manuel Zelaya, which Canada backed. But on top of that, he goes 2 terms, and that's completely against the Honduran constitution. And so he got the Supreme Court to sort of bypass the Constitution to claim he had the right to run again. And then when he was losing in the vote, he was down by 5 percentage points after 70% of the voting count had transpired. The vote count stops for 36 hours. And then when it comes back on, he's in the lead, and he wins by a small margin. So Hernandez's second term, his first term is questionable because there's an aftermath of the coup and there's a repressive environment and whatnot. But his second term was totally unconstitutional, and then he rigged the vote. But despite that, Trudeau government really right away claimed that he was legitimate, and then worked, treated the government as if it was a totally legitimate government, invite him to Canadian events, and made him an ally in the Lima Group, trying to force their interpretation of the Venezuelan constitution, an erroneous interpretation, on that country by having Juan Guaido as president. So it was a real farce. I talked about this a bunch of times. I wrote about this and talked about it in many interviews and articles where you had this Honduran illegitimate, completely illegitimate, constitutionally stolen election, part of this Lima group coming to Canada to demand that Nicolas Maduro adhere to their interpretation of the Venezuelan constitution. But so we backed Juan Orlando Hernandez. And this drug trafficking, I think they're saying is 40 tons. I think it was 40 tons of cocaine that he was implicated in it. Apparently his brother, who was a senator, is involved in it. I didn't follow the details about very vast drug trafficking operation with, I think, the Colombian cartels, the Mexicans, a whole bunch of different groups kind of in and basically using Honduras as a gateway into the US market. And so this it was widely understood that it was a sort of narco, as people referred to it, was a post 2009 coup. It was a neoliberal narco dictatorship in Honduras that we were supporting. That was good for Canadian mining companies, the Vancouver one, with the forgetting his name now. I don't think it's around anymore. Anyways, they were behind the coup. They were angry with Manuel Zelaya, and then Gildan Activewear, which is a huge sweatshops in Honduras, was also angry with Zelaya. So this narco dictatorship neoliberal narco dictatorship was quite good for Canadian corporate interests in Honduras, and so we were sort of backing the government there overseeing that. There's also a dispute with Venezuela. The Venezuelan foreign minister criticized the Canadian High Commissioner in Guyana's intervention. And so the Venezuelan foreign ministers referred to Canada's colonialist aspirations. And basically the dispute between Venezuela and Guyana over the Essequibo, the territory in the west of Guyana, which has become very controversial because there's huge oil that ExxonMobil is getting at, and it's very just not many people that live there, a very small number of people, mostly indigenous. It's a complicated dispute, but the Venezuelans are complaining that Canada is intervening in the dispute, even though it's not its place, and intervening on behalf of Exxon Mobil. And so, of course, this fits into a longer-standing Canadian policy on Venezuela. Guyana is an interesting country in terms of Canada's role. I've written about it like once, but Canada has significant influence in Guyana, and I feel like it's really underexplored area. It's like a quarter of Guyana's population lives in Toronto, and Canada is quite an influential country in what has been an extremely poor, impoverished place, but now is a huge going to be a huge oil producer. Shifting gears a bit, there's a new chief of defense staff, first woman, Jenny Kerrigan, first woman ever in that position. That's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. On I think Thursday, maybe Friday, they began the cutting of the steel at the Irving shipyard in Halifax for the 15 surface combatant vessels that are going to cost about $80 billion to produce. They have all kinds of high-tech weaponry, and that can, I think, these missiles can go like 1,500 kilometers, hit targets from 1,500 kilometers away. And that's a huge amount of public resources being plowed into that. There's a story a couple days ago in the front of the business section of Globe Mail about MDA, the Vancouver-based space company. I just got a $1 billion contract from the Canadian Space Agency. And what's interesting here for the Canadarm3, and it's tied into
Yeah.
NASA.
Fine.
And
Yeah. Okay.
there's
You are.
Yeah,
Okay. Yeah. Good.
they're with my mother.
picture. Mute yourself.
He's a guy.
Yeah.
He's a guy. I don't know
Good.
who the hell
Can you
he
make sure to
is.
mute yourself, everyone? Sorry, I didn't. Didn't. Oh yeah. Okay. Sorry. Good. Okay, I think I may have made it so people can't unmute themselves without being without asking. But yeah, so the MDA issue is important or is interesting because they've been kind of like a company that's a huge public subsidy as part of the kind of the militarization of space. And also they're tied in, like, Boeing in the US is a big plays a big role with NASA, which is of course also a huge one of the biggest arms producers in the world. And this is a kind of like a node of public subsidy into the corporate sector tied into militarization. That's an important part of understanding the military and the power of the military. And one of its uses historically has been as a place of cutting edge research. Right, the first computers in Canada were produced with military money, research funding, and space has become that area. And it's done ostensibly through a sort of a civilian space program, but the connection between the civilian and more militarized space program is a bit it's the line there is a bit unclear. And MDA was part of building the radar sats, which is a Canadian cutting edge radar, and they were giving that to Ukraine, for instance. Canada was gifting that to Ukraine for a number of years, and then it was stopped, and I think it may have been restarted since Russia's invasion. I'm not exactly sure about that, but it's something that Canadian military uses, and it's sorry, if anyone who sees that their audio is not muted, please do mute it, because I think there's somebody who unmuted themselves before I placed a restriction on that. So if you could do that, that would be much appreciated. So that's a question, and the Americans, of course, are quickly trying to they're militarizing space in contravention of different accords that have been signed on that issue. The Globe and Mail had an op-ed from the Ernie Regier and the former senator out, I believe, in Alberta, big nuclear disarmament people. I'm forgetting his name right. Roche, and it was basically about how the whole sort of nuclear arm disarmament infrastructure has been ripped up, and that the New START I treaty is the last of those that's still current, but it comes due in 2026, and it limits strategic nuclear warheads to 1,550 each between the US and Russia, and that the negotiations to renew that are nothing's happening there. And they criticize the Trudeau government for not saying anything on the matter. I think rightfully so. They're too nice to the Trudeau government. The Trudeau government has refused to sign the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which has been signed by more than 100 countries. Well, it's been endorsed. I don't think it's signed more. I think it's like 60 countries signed it, but it's been endorsed by like 120 or something like that countries. So that's unfortunate, and that's just one more layer of that tension between the U.S. and Russia. That's part of what's going on in Ukraine and part of the background of what's going on in Ukraine. And on the note of nuclear weapons, Putin, according to New York Times headline, vows to make new nuclear missiles and to weigh placing them near NATO nations. So the intermediate range nuclear arms deal that the Trump administration ripped up, I believe, partly because they wanted to um, sort of deploy these short range missiles towards China, is my understanding that why they were moved against it and ripped it up. And so the Russians are now threatening to basically put these types of weapons in more and more places that would be either targeting NATO countries or targeting U.S. allies. I guess presumably like in Asia, countries like Japan and South Korea, I guess. So that's part, and of course, it's Russia's partly a reaction to different escalatory moves that the Americans and other NATO countries have made in Ukraine. There's a piece titled "NATO to offer Ukraine bridge to membership in Trump-proof move." So this NATO summit coming up, they're trying to set up, give some stuff to Ukraine as part of trying to have that issue kind of not take over the whole NATO summit. They're not gonna Ukraine's not going to be joining NATO, but they want to make some commitments around constantly arming the country and other sort of security commitments, which of course Russia would see would be against. Now, in a note of this sort of like this tit for tat and escalation, the Wall Street Journal published a piece titled "Russian Saboteurs Blamed for Arson." And it was an operation in Germany that was producing some weapons in Germany. And they're saying that the Russians were behind it. Now, I have no idea if the Russians were behind it, but to me, and I get that this is a very tricky area where there's both sides, there would be self-interest in lying from different directions, right? One self-interest in lying would be just to hype up all the bad Russians and this and that. But I think it's also correct to say that the Germans would be a little bit cautious, even if they thought some Russian operatives were responsible. It was like a fire that destroyed the factory, plausibly just because of some, like malfunction. But they would also be a bit cautious in blaming the Russians for something like that, because they would be worried about how that could lead into public opinion, lead into questions of NATO. Sort of what was an attack on a NATO country and stuff like that. Now, it makes complete sense to me from a Russian perspective. If Germany and these countries are going to be close countries, that you have the capacity to target a arms production facility that are providing weapons to Ukrainians, it makes sense to me that the Russians would want to have a fire take place at that plant. They would want to do sabotage to the extent that they could probably avoid getting blamed for it, and they can do it in a fairly clean way. But I would presume the KGB and the Russian state has the capacity to do some of this stuff, and it makes sense to me that they would do this stuff as this escalatory dynamic, plays out, that would take place. So, I don't know about this specific detail, but the macro makes complete sense to me. The Russians also said that they are preparing a response to U.S. drone flights over the Black Sea. So apparently more and more U.S. drones over the Black Sea. The Russians say that it was U.S. drones that provided the Ukrainians with the intelligence in that recent bombing of a beach in Crimea, which I think it killed 4 Russian civilians. That didn't make that much attention here, but it was a big deal in Russia. And so they're blaming the Americans for that, and they're saying there's going to be a response to these flights. Who knows what that will mean and what will happen there? But the trajectory is I think in that escalatory dynamic. And another one in that is that Biden lifted a de facto ban on U.S. military contractors deploying to Ukraine. So now U.S. military contractors are allowed to deploy to Ukraine. And the line between the U.S. military, U.S. contractors, these guys are often, were formerly in the military, special forces sometimes, and then they're soon just out of the military and they're working for a contractor. So, you're getting into some gray area of what is, actual U.S. military and sort of U.S. private military and whatever. On Canada, on a note of Canada, the World Socialist website had a piece headline: Canada backing Zelensky regime's effort to conscript those who fled war and use them as cannon fodder. So there's a bigger and bigger problem with conscription, and hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian men who fled the country against the law. And there's the whole question of the Ukrainians are trying to say we're not going to give any services to those people unless they come back into the country, in which they could get conscripted. Now, the Canadian government seems to have made a conditionality on the process of getting Canadian status dependent on being kind of like in proper terms with the Ukrainian government, which would basically mean men who are in Canada would have to return to Ukraine to get their proper documents, and then might get conscripted. So that's an interesting Canadian contribution to this. Somewhat controversial. It's going on all over Western Europe and Central Europe, Eastern Europe, where there's huge numbers of Ukrainians, and there's lots of governments that are pushing the men to go back to fight to the last Ukrainian. Now, on the note of China, there's been a number of stories this week about the electric vehicle tariff surtax that Canada's bringing in, and lots of debate in the business pages about this question. And one piece in the Globe about how this clearly violates WTO rules that Canada's brought in, and so this is the U.S. or Canada following the U.S., which also brought in these tariffs on Chinese vehicles, very stiff tariffs, and the I don't actually tariffs and I'm not a fan of the WTO per se. I think that countries controlling trade and investment to better serve their populations or the environment or the like is a good thing. And I think that sort of neoliberal policies of giving more and more power to multinationals to decide where they base their operations for their own profit-seeking reasons is not something that anyone on the left should defend. But what this fits into that geopolitical dynamic that is a more, I think, a dangerous dynamic that is going on here. And Canada, of course, subsidizes electric, as you've seen, the huge subsidies to these electric automotive facilities to set up in Canada. So the idea that the Canadian government is like complaining about the subsidies to electric vehicles in China is a bit of a hypocritical kind of position. Now, the Dimitri Lascaris published a piece yesterday, I believe it was, titled "Is Canada's Parliament Concealing Embarrassing Information About Canada's Allies?" And it's his look at the preliminary report from the foreign interference judge, Marie Hogg. Is it Marie Hogg? I forget her first name. Yeah, I think it's Marie. And which came out 6 or 7 weeks ago. And the big takeaway for me, there's a bunch of stuff in the piece worth taking a look at. But the big takeaway for me in this piece that's worth really considering, in that when you get back, he basically points out that when you get down to it, the allegations of on these MPs unwittingly or wittingly supporting a foreign country, and it basically relies on CSIS's word. That's the essence of it. And CSIS is, I forget the exact number he says, but CSIS is quoted like 160 times or something like that. So basically it gets down to like CSIS's word. They don't provide the actual evidence. They just sort of say that, this it's CSIS's word that this happened. And so what he goes at, which I think is very important, is that is CSIS to be trusted? And like, is that institution one that has a history of being reliable? And of course he concludes that no, it doesn't, and he lists all kinds of examples where CSIS has been shown, not just individuals within CSIS, but the institution itself has been found to be not reliable, and that courts and judges have come to that conclusion. And you got the Maharar case, you got a long history of that. And so that's, when we talk about the foreign interference brouhaha, that's kind of like left out of the whole mix, is that they are the central, they are the source of the major claims, and it's not really reliable, and they're not actually giving us the evidence. They're just saying we have this, but we're not actually showing it to you. So that's I think with the whole foreign interference one part. On the foreign interference file, which of course is all subtext, is it's all China, and I didn't read the whole preliminary report, but I scanned through some of it, and it's really fascinating in the report that they mention China and Chinese diaspora many times. They mention Indians diaspora, they mention Iranian, Pakistani, and they mention Russia. I don't know if they actually mention Russian diaspora per se, but they definitely mention Russia a bunch of times. So it's not like, the US, Ukrainians. Okay. Now, the idea that we're in a time where there's a very organized Ukrainian Canadian push for billions of dollars in weapons and $10+ billion in other forms of support for Ukraine, and that's not like at all. It's just like the word Ukrainian is not in there. I searched the document. That's just kind of wiped out. So we talk about diasporas. We talk about, clearly there are, and many of them are quite recent immigrants. And now a big chunk of the Ukrainian community goes back like, a century or more. But many of them are quite recent, including, over just the last two and a bit years, and that they are lobbying clearly for a certain type of policy, and that's not viewed in any way as foreign interference when it's anything comparable by China or Chinese community organizations is clearly defined as foreign interference. But with Ukraine, it's not, and it's all, of course, because it fits with NATO and Canada's geopolitical objectives, and that's what, when we talk about foreign interference, we're not actually talking about the role of the French government in Canada, and all the different French institutes. The Italian government has a different Italian institutes. You got the German government with its Goethe Institute, actually one here in Montreal, a few blocks from where I am, and all these other, not to mention the U.S. and Israel, which we've got into before, but all those kind of questions are just kind of left out, and it's the countries that are viewed as two parts going on: enemies and racialized. Right? White people are not really viewed as diaspora that could be foreign interference, form of foreign interference. Maybe a little bit with Russia, though you don't hear that much with Russia because there's not actually that many Russians in Canada. But yeah, so the kind of the geostrategic element and the racial element is there. Judy Haven has a good piece titled "Who Are the Real Foreign Interferers," where she looks at Israel's interference in Canada, worth checking out. On Iran, there's fallout from the listing of the IRGC, which I discussed last week, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. The Iranians sent a letter to the UN Security Council and the Secretary General, and they called it a blatant violation of international law and the Charter of the United Nations. So listing Iran's military as a terrorist organization. It of course, one of the things they cited when listing it was that they were supporting Hezbollah in Lebanon. And there's a good piece, Owen Schock has a good piece in Canadian Dimension titled "Israel is Stoking All-Out War and Canada's Complicit." So this issue, which is picking up on the border with Lebanon, and the Canadian government is, the Foreign Minister Jolie had a discussion with her Israeli counterpart a few days ago, where they reported that Canada's talking about the Canadians who are in Lebanon, is talk about Jolie saying the Canadians who are in Lebanon to get out, and there's plans for if there is full-fledged war to get them out and all that. That stuff's going on. Now, Canada is clearly contributing, supporting essentially Israel as it's moving towards what could ignite a huge war, which as I said, it's picking up. Let's hope it doesn't go beyond where it's already gone. But that is taking place. Also on the Iran file, Iran of course had elections, and a number of Iranian outlets and one of the Cuban outlets pointed out about they blocked Iranians from voting. So Iranians in Canada were not allowed to vote in the election. The Canadian government, apparently, this is the only country that did that, according to the Iranians. The Cuban news agency had a story headline: Canada, which harps on democracy, bars thousands of Iranians from voting. So we have this growing, continuing tensions with Iran, which is a form, in part, a form of support for Israel, which matters increasingly in the context of Israel going into a bigger and bigger war with Hezbollah. Hezbollah being, when they talk about Iranian proxies, that's I think a bit of a misnomer. To the extent there may be an Iranian proxy, Hezbollah would be the closest to that. It has many relations to Iran. It is also a indigenous Lebanese organization that fought against Israeli occupation and has its own very legitimate political reasons to exist. But it's of course tied to Iran, and a bigger war with Hezbollah will have broader regional implications. Now, the Israeli onslaught in Gaza is just beyond belief. A couple hours ago, I was watching some Al Jazeera reporting, and the head of the hospital operations in Gaza was just released, and he was released from this Israeli prison. So they released like 50 or 60, mostly the older looking men into Gaza today, just dumped them in two different spots in Gaza. And they've been detained. This one guy had been detained. Again, he's like the head of, I'm not sure he was the head of just a single hospital, if he was head of like the whole overseeing of hospitals in Gaza. So he's somebody of a certain degree of prominence, in the health sector in Gaza. And they detained him for, I think it was like 6 or 7 months in this facility in Israel. That's a sort of like secret kind of dungeon prison where apparently there are 1,000 Palestinian kidnapped Palestinians that they're holding there. And they show these images in Al Jazeera. They basically don't give them any food. And these guys, old guys, are like 67 years old. They like picked up their shirts, and you'd see these like abscesses and just like really horrible mistreatment. And again, these are the people, first of all, they've released them. So they've, kind of concluded they couldn't get them on anything. And they're older men. And at least this guy was of some degree of prominence. And this is how they treat them. The cruelty, the Israeli cruelty of Israel is just beyond belief. And like, there's none of it. We've heard like how many times have every single politician in Canada, the most left-wing politician in the country, talked about the hostages in Gaza. And then when you see the images, and people point this out on Twitter, you see the images of the Israelis released from Gaza, and they like have smiles on their faces, and they look like they've been well treated and they're fairly well fed despite the horrible conditions in Gaza. And then you see the Palestinians that are released, and there's all these like Palestinians who've been clearly psychologically damaged and tortured and physical marks, and it's just like night and day. It's like the cruelty of Israel and how they treat the hostages is infinitely worse than what we're told is the barbaric Hamas. And whatever. This is just a general, and you don't even hear any mention of this. Any Canadian politician even mention the kidnapped thousands. It's like 10,000 kidnapped Palestinians over the past 9 months. It's just like unmentionable by Canadian politicians. I saw a graphic on the bombing in Gaza where it said that there's been 79,000 tons dropped versus 13,000 tons in Hiroshima. And the area of Hiroshima is much bigger than the area of Gaza. So just give again sense of the destruction. Now, a couple things. I've gone on again too long. Just a couple of things I wanted to mention. So on Thursday's front page of the National Post, big picture at the top, is a headline saying why some Jews are saying goodbye to Canada. And they're basically trying to hype up this idea that there's lots of Canadian Jews who've moved to Israel or planning on moving to Israel because of anti-Semitism in Canada. Now, the numbers they provide are very minimal. So they basically say, I think it's they say about 500 Canadian Jews moved to Israel in like a year ago in the same period, and then I think they say 1,000 have moved in the past 8 or 9 months. So it's a bit of an increase from the 500. Oh yeah, no, actually, but then they say that actually during the COVID times it was even higher than during the COVID time. But then they just sort of said that was just about COVID. Anyway, so the numbers are very. They choose one period that shows that it is a bit increase, but we're talking about very minimal numbers. And then they kind of offer the fact that it was actually higher during COVID, but they were just going to throw that one away because it had to do with COVID. I don't know about exactly where the numbers are at, but they're in a story that's really hyping the issue. They don't really give very convincing numbers. Now, the flip side to this is the Canadian Jewish News published this piece all about how many Israelis are trying to move to Canada. And apparently there's some site that some Israeli couple that moved here a couple years ago. And it's interesting that they're very vague in the politics of it in the Canadian Jewish News, but they strongly imply that it's like Israel's this racist country that we don't want anything to do with it. That's kind of what these people say, but in very soft kind of language. And they set up a site for Israelis to learn what they need to do to come to Canada and this and that. And apparently there's like 200,000 Israelis that have checked out this website. And so there's apparently lots of Israelis coming to Canada. And Bennett, the former prime minister, is quoted saying, "Do not leave the country," urges Israelis to stay amid exodus. So lots and lots of Israelis have have another passport and make it very easy for them to leave. So there's more and more indication that there has been or there's a picking up of Israelis leaving the country because the mood is very grim. By any standard, they haven't been able to ethnically cleanse Gaza. They haven't been able to wipe out Hamas or resistance. So by Zionist standards, by the things put forward by the Netanyahus of the world, things aren't looking very good. And then you have a situation where there's 60, 70, whatever, 1,000, 80,000 Israelis on the border with Lebanon who've been displaced for 9 months. They're not able to stop that. They may be crazy enough to go all the way in with a war on Lebanon, and they can do an incredible amount of damage in Lebanon, but Hezbollah can also do a fair bit of damage in Israel. So the National Post is hyping this issue and completely ignoring the other side, which would be how many Israelis have come to Canada. And I guarantee you it's many more Israelis have come to Canada. And so that doesn't fit their propaganda thing. They're trying to hype up the anti-Semitism thing. That's part of it, of course. It's about creating this fear. It's about creating, the world's crashing down. Anti-Semitism's all over, da-da-da-da. Jews need to flee, da-da-da-da. But they don't want to look at how many Israelis are coming here. So that's an interesting issue. The other issue I want to talk about briefly is the whole Human Rights Commissioner, which is big brouhaha. The Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs through the Globe and Mail began this, I guess, about a week ago. And the newly appointed, what's the official title? Chief Commissioner of the Canadian Human Rights Commission, Burju Datani. And they're going after him because he shared 10 years ago or 15 years ago or something like that when he was an academic. He was on some panel that had some guy who was I don't know, sort of hardline Muslim exact wording what they claim the guy did, one group, but somebody who's dubious. They're claiming Islamic fundamentalist group in Britain that favors global Sharia law, according to this Globe Mail piece. And then he said that terrorism has had success. I guess that was one of his academic pursuits, and looked at, in fact, that you frame it as like terror is just all illogical, but then there's all this history. And then he's been on some things where he has said that, I don't know, he's been done some research on like boycotts, divestment, sanctions, and he's apparently never actually supported BDS on Israel, but he's sort of, I don't know, he's kind of participated in forums where there's been discussions of this that from an Israeli lobby perspective are threatening or whatever. Anyways, they made a big kerfuffle about this guy, and he was the former head of the Yukon Human Rights Commission, and he was also on the board, I think, of the Alberta Human Rights Commission. So he's got these like real establishment credentials on the file. But they're, the Israel lobby, they want to whip up the whole kerfuffle about this and da 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 da. And they're doing that, and I don't know, they might succeed in having the guy. He's already apologized for the hurt that the Canadian Jewish community has felt from whatever he did. Or, anyways, it's all that the same old. We've seen this story dozens and dozens of times. But it continues on. It's amazing that it continues on amidst the onslaught, the Holocaust that Israel's committing in Gaza, but it does. Now, one final thing, I think maybe, or two, I guess two of these final things I'll do real brief. So the Goldie Gamari, who's this Iranian Canadian MPP in Ontario, total fanatic Zionist, totally right wing, far right wing kind of person. She met with Tommy Robinson, this British guy who's Ezra Levant's group has brought, Rebel News has brought across the country, and he's from the far right in Britain, long history of all kinds of different criminality and anti-Muslim and this and that. I'm not far from an expert on the guy, but he's from the, he was the head of the, I think he was the head of the English Defense League. Correct me if I'm wrong there. And so anyway, she met with him, and then Doug Ford pushed her out of caucus because of that, which I think was the right move for Doug Ford. Now, what I find interesting about this, she's Iranian. I think she's Muslim background. She's not Jewish. But there's a demonstration. So the pushback of her being pushed out of the caucus. So this is like, to the right of Doug Ford people in Ontario, pushing back against him, turfing her. These are people who support Tommy Robinson or who support Ezra Levant and Rebel and this kind of stuff. That milieu. They put the push back against it is that her being turfed is anti-Semitism. Okay. And they're actually organizing this one guy, Boardman, he's a prominent guy in the pro-Israel, far right, he's into like sort of Hindu nationalist kind of stuff and China interference stuff. He's a right-wing guy across the board. And he has his tweet is, per request of the NDP and the Muslim Brotherhood, Doug Ford has removed one of the few MPPs who has spoken out about anti-Semitism. Okay, as if Doug Ford and all of them haven't spoken out anti-Semitism. Anyways, but so she's one of the only ones that's went. And so they're organizing a rally on Wednesday, and the headline of the rally to defend this Goldie Gamari is Doug Ford, stop caving to anti-Semites. Okay. So now the defense, this is very explicitly the defense of the far right, right? Explicit, the defense of the far right is those targeting the far right are the anti-Semites. And therefore you're being anti-Semitic because you're caving to the anti-Semites by pushing out this far right MPP. This is the terrain that this is all, we've seen this process going. It's of course really big in France right now. Right, the attack against Mélenchon, François Insoumise, and the left coalition that did get second in the recent elections, it's that they're the anti-Semites, right? Marie Le Pen is the they're just they just hate the Muslims, so they're now become like and she just actually Marine Le Pen said she was a Zionist. I just saw that online. Anyway, so that divide is playing out, and the whole anti-Semitism card is being used in this divide very interesting ways. Okay, now the final thing, again, I've gone on way too long. I apologize. Is I do want to touch on this. So the National Post on Friday, I think it was, had the front big picture of Jeremy Levy, the mayor of Hampstead, and says one Liberal riding down is Mount Royal next. And they're basically using the by-election in St. Paul, the Toronto area, which has I think it's about 12, I've seen different numbers, 12 to 15% Jewish riding. The Conservatives won the by-election, and is Mount Royal, where Anthony Housefather is that going to go Conservative? And he's already setting up that lawyer. It's fascinating. That lawyer that I challenged at the courthouse is the Zionist lawyer who did the injunction for I'm blanking on his name right now. The injunction for McGill and a whole series of them. Anyways, it looks like he's going to be running against Anthony Housefather as like the ultra Zionist against the ultra Zionist in that riding. And so they have Jeremy Levy on the front page here, talking about it and basically saying the Conservatives can win this and we're going to get behind it, and Housefather is a sellout, and Jeremy Levy is on record. He's on record saying he would continue to support Israel if they killed 100,000 or more Palestinian children. This is who gets quoted in the National Post, put on the front page, like a profile of the guy. This is a nice picture of him on the front page, takes up like half of the front page. This is, imagine somebody said, if 100,000 Israeli children were killed, I would keep supporting whoever did that, no matter if 100,000 or more. Like, this is insane, right? But this is like totally normalized that Palestinians are insects, right? Yeah, you can kill the children, they're just insects. Yes, anyone who says that, you get front page, no problem. This is, reliable. This is a moral force, right? It's just remarkable. And then kind of at a slightly different angle to the same dynamic is you have what's her name in the Globe and Mail op-ed? She's in Toronto, a younger woman, Jewish woman. I'm forgetting her name right now, blanking on the op-ed person. She used to be at the National Post. And she has a piece titled, Housefather Can Best Represent Jews by Walking Away from the Liberals. And so she's criticizing, this is a bit more, a bit more sophisticated Globe Mail's way, basically coming at the same thing. Housefather should resign from the Liberal Party because the Liberal Party has not, enabled all of the killing that Israel's committed. They've put in some reservations, and this how outrageous these reservations are. They're anti-Jewish, So this is the media sphere, the dynamic of this kind of one-up, just craziness, right? Housefather has got to go. And then just the final thing is the encampments. There's a lawsuit against University of Waterloo encampment, $1.5 million from the university going after the students. On the counter side to that, here in Montreal, encampments that started by the Quebec Pension Plan last Saturday. I went down there when I got back in town. It's going strong. The rally on Sunday left from there, and they're calling for divestment from the pension plan. So the encampments are still going. Still have demonstrations. And here in Montreal, it's like, I don't know, it's probably been the 100th. It's about 40 weekends in a row of mass demonstrations. Probably the 100th mass protest. There was a blockade of rail as well. So the demonstrations continue, the mobilization continues. But I've gone on way too long. It's already 7 o'clock. I will open it up. I will make Laura a co-host, and I've just unmuted you. Yuri, go ahead quickly, and I'm making Laura co-host.
Okay. Thanks, Eve. I just Yeah, firstly, I just want to say I read your tribute to your uncle, and my sincerest condolences over the loss of your uncle, and may he rest in power and rest in peace. I was wondering because you mentioned Congo, can you talk about the left's role in actually supporting the overthrow of democratic socialist, democratically elected leader of Congo, Patrice Lumumba, and if the and what of the left's continued role in neocolonialism in Congo? And the electric car, I was wondering, I'm curious your opinion on the electric car and whether it is the savior for humanity. The Green Party co-leader, Adrian Ramsey in Britain, he got some pushback for wanting to transition off fossil fuel cars to electric cars. And those propping up the electric car, aren't they actually making the case for nuclear energy to continue because we need something to, power up those electric cars?
Yeah, I'm not I wrote co-authored a book with Bianca called Stop Science, Cars and Capitalism on the Road to Economic, Social, and Ecological Decay back in 2021, I think it was.
Great book.
I think the private automobile should be the dustbin of history. That's not to say that the technology doesn't have utility, it does. And to the extent that the technology continues, probably it's better that it's electric versus gas, oil powered. But the basic notion is we need to be building urban spaces where people can get around by foot, by bike, by light rail, by bus, by metro, and so yeah, there's clearly a role for vehicles in delivering goods. There's a role for vehicles in people who have disabilities. There's a role for that kind of stuff. But the basic structuring of cityscapes, urban, and also I think there's a role for vehicles in farming and kind of rural areas, but where most people live in cities, there shouldn't really be private automobiles, and so that's then leads you towards, and that's not just for a whole host of reasons, ecological reasons most important, obviously the climate crisis most importantly, but also the incredible amount of resources used in having 3 or 4 thousand pound metal boxes carry one person, 150, 200 pound person around. That's a very inefficient use of resources, and you can't have, if you want to have equity in the world, then you have to say, well, if everyone in the world had cars like they do here in North America, that would be $5 or $6 billion, 5 or 6 billion private automobiles in the world. Now, so there's that element, and where does the energy source come from? If it comes from coal, if electricity comes from coal, it can even be more carbon emitting than oil for cars that are electric vehicles. But if it comes from, here in Quebec, where you have fairly little greenhouse gas emissions that come out of the electricity process, then it's much less so. But they're still, they're damming up different ecologies to build. Hydro-Quebec is destroying ecosystems to build dams to provide the electricity, right? So, and they're building new ones, right? So it's yeah, that's a question. Now on the Congo and the left, I don't remember if I have anything in the left-right book on that issue. I don't think I do, but I don't remember the Canadian left's role in supporting the coup against Lumumba. I think there was maybe a little bit, maybe one of the unions, I think, supported that. I can't remember right now. Now today, with regards to the Congo, I think that there is a sort of buy-in. The Romeo Dallaire mythology, for instance, is basically a tool in the hands of Kagame to intervene in Eastern Congo. I've talked about that previously. I won't get into the details on that, but and there's many on the left that have been involved in that. In fact, African Union's report on the Rwandan genocide was authored in Toronto by Stephen Lewis's buddy, the former Globe Kaplan, Gerald Kaplan, and so yeah, that there's been a long history of liberal left Canada kind of enabling Kagame in different ways. But yeah, I can't think of anything else on the Congo left stuff. But.
Okay, Philip, go ahead, please.
Hi. On the issue of the by-election results there in St. Paul, and where Trudeau's getting a lot of pressure, do you think it might be worthwhile exploring possibly some sort of grassroots effort to say to Trudeau, you need to actually start following international law, not the rules-based order, and also that he would be wise to maybe before the election rush through electoral reform to dampen what looks like it's going to be a conservative landslide, because the Zionists, they're all going to go to the conservatives this election. Doesn't matter what they're doing. So maybe if Trudeau, the leader of the Liberal Party, says we're going to push international law, we're going to sign on to the ICJ and all that, get enforcer rulings and that sort of thing, and start showing support for the Palestinians in this country and in Gaza. And also on foreign interference, I was wondering, since there's a lot of foreign interference that we don't talk about, but my thought is there any way we could somehow do it ourselves, like as individuals? Can I make a donation legally to, say, the Green Party of the United States? Because if I'm interested in global peace, addressing NATO or Canada, contributing more to NATO, our defense budget going up to go to NATO, if I want to be effective, surely the way to do that is get somebody like Jill Stein elected. And since they're asking me to contribute, maybe I should be allowed to donate to Jill Stein and us as individuals, whether it's legally or illegally. I prefer something legal, but I don't know if there is such a way to do that.
My understanding is that you can't. That the U.S. has restrictions that it has to be U.S. citizens that are funding with elections. You can fund a whole slew of other. You can give a donation to like Counterpunch. I know my dad. Actually, you can even get a tax receipt for a donation to Counterpunch as a Canadian donor. There would be some of that stuff, but I don't think you can election. I'm not sure about that with U.S. The business, I've seen that come up a bit about the changing the first past the post now. I would be amenable to that because I was amenable to that previously, and they promised it, right? I think it would look kind of bad if you did it now, and so you would be sort of undermining a little bit of the. But I think it's the right thing to do, so I'm supportive of it. I don't know how much traction it will get as a campaign. And there was a third thing that I wanted to respond to. I can't remember the yeah, I can't remember what the other
Philip, do you want to repeat what your third thing was?
St. Paul's. Yeah, so around the election, the by-election. Now, the one thing I saw a poll that said that it was the Jewish community in the riding went around 65% conservative, and about 20 something for the Liberals, 21, 22, and I think 9 or 10 to the NDP. So that's clearly a pretty strong support for the Conservatives. That includes Forest Hill, so that would be a fairly well off, I think, Jewish community that would be in the riding. you know, that are they've been conservative voters for a long time. I think probably they all vote Doug Ford provincially, because I know that they provincially the conservatives win there and have I think won there for a while. Now so this is interesting. There's very interesting dynamics that come out of all this, right? Because this has been tons of stories. Is that the electoral the media is wanting us to believe that the electoral downside for the Liberals is to be critical of Israel because Canadian Jews will then vote against Liberals. That's the media is trying to push that, and I think there is truths within that. There is, I think that is true. You know, I'm not. There's a whole segment of the left that I see as design. If they're trying to sort of exculpate the Jewish community's support for Israel's Holocaust in Gaza, and they try to kind of say that the Jewish community doesn't really support it, or it's they sort of, you know, that I don't believe that's true. I actually believe that most of the Canadian Jews do support Israel, and supporting Israel means supporting the horrors in Gaza. And you can split hairs about does it just mean that, or as Globe Mail columnists tried to play in there, you know, horrified what's going, concerned about what's going on in Gaza, but support Israel. Like, yeah, as if, right? It's no, sorry. In the current context, certainly if you're going to vote conservative, in part because you're concerned about the Liberals, in this context, clearly that is endorsing, that is promoting more support for horrors in Gaza. There's no doubt about that. Now, but so that there's a dynamic that's playing out there. But the other dynamic that gets very little attention, of course, is that the Liberals know that there are a bunch of seats, principally with significant numbers of Arabs and Muslims, that they've won and they could lose on this issue. But I believe there's a really big strategic intervention that the Palestine Solidarity World can do and should do around targeting a couple of ridings hard. Liberals have supported a genocide. Don't vote Liberal. And I think there's a by-election coming up in around Verdun in Montreal, where Lametti his seat, and that's a riding. They won. The Liberals won by a decent number, but not a huge number. That's a riding which would be very opportune. Doesn't have a big Arab Muslim population, but it's a fairly left-wing riding. It's voted Quebec Solidaire in some of the provincial. It's voted Quebec Solidaire. I think it's a place where that kind of intervention by Palestine Solidarity with a hard intervention. Now, I've actually been in some discussions with people who are planning an intervention there when the by-election starts. I think they're making a big mistake in how they're doing the intervention, because they're not. I think they may be a little too anarchist infused, and they don't want to just specifically target the Liberals. I think that's a pretty significant strategic error. But the point being is that there are some of those interventions where, so the media is trying to tell us that, you know, there's an electoral downside, but I think we actually have the capacity, if asserted. We don't have the media that hype the issue, but if asserted from a grassroots standpoint, where we can defeat Liberal and contribute to defeating Liberal MPs because of Palestine, and I think that's be a really important intervention to do. But it has to be hyper targeted, and it has to be, in my opinion, and hyper intense, and it's based upon something we did with Haiti in 2006 in flooding the riding of Pierre Pettigrew, the foreign minister. I think I've talked about that previously, so I won't get into it. But yeah, so I think that there are these types of interventions, and the media is clearly, it's so pro-Israel. You know, it's never going to focus on the fact that, you know, Arabs and Muslims or leftists are unhappy with the Liberals for backing genocide. It's going to focus on, you know, Canadian Jews, even though if you look at it numerically, the Jewish population versus the Arab and Muslim population is very small now. Yeah, it's all part of the sort of pro-Israel bias in the media, is to hype up the concerns of the Jewish community, of pro-Israel Jewish community specifically, on this. But yeah, so.
Well, Eve, do you think it's so much there are no other questions, so the that there is so much that they're worried about the vote of Jewish Canadians than it is about the money that they can pour into campaign ads. I can't remember in Canada now. Do you have anything like the super PACs we have in the US where they just like pour in that money, like what they just did to Jimmy Bowman? I mean, don't you think it's more the money that they can put in to get those people out of?
Yeah, it's not. There's no comparison between the finance question in the U.S. and Canada. There is no. It's the controls on third party funding and donations to parties. It's just so different that it's just there is and clearly what happened. I mean, there's no doubt what just happened with Bowman in the primary, the Democratic primary, was that Jewish billionaires who are wildly pro-Israel just pumped in. There was more money spent in a Democratic primary than the Conservative Party will spend for the whole federal election in Canada.
Yeah, 15 million by that.
Yeah, my understanding is it's going to be the final tally will be something closer to $20 million.
Oh, really?
Right? And so I mean, it's just this is insane amounts of money. And the way AIPAC does that is that they don't even make it pro-Israel, right? They do it for Israel reasons, but the messaging doesn't. Israel's not part of the messaging. It's basically just dump a bunch of money from overwhelmingly or basically entirely Jewish supporters of Israel, mostly from the billionaire class, the people like the Sheldon Adelsons of the world, and they then use it just to go at the politician with whatever the weakness is. It doesn't, Israel's not even brought up because they actually even know that Israel's not an issue that plays that well among Democratic primaries. But then on top of that, with Bowman, they did a whole campaign to get like Republicans and independents to sign up to be Democrats so they could vote against Bowman, right? And so you pump in all this money to organize. I mean, that's very getting into really like micro organizing campaigns in the district. I mean, it's the power of money in U.S. politics is on a whole different scale.
Oh yeah, they brag about it on their website, like AIPAC. They have I think it's a 97% success rate, and when they put their money into it, they defeat the person. They have that history back all the way back to what is it, Cynthia McKinney, decades ago. I just have one other question, which is, do you think that the far right is so absolutely pro-Israel in different countries simply because they hate Muslims more than they hate Jews, or like why is that across countries that not just the far right, but the right broadly is just so.
Well, there is an interesting dynamic, right? There is a far right in the U.S. like that. Nick Fuentes is the main person I hear of that is clearly anti-Semitic and critical of Israel, right? So he's this like young, like I guess he's sort of like a David Duke type, but a younger, a little bit hipper kind of repackaging of some of that politics, but the mainstream far right is totally pro-Israel. That's like the Candace Owens dynamic in the States is kind of an interesting one with that, with her leaving. She's kind of represents a different kind of little bit of a breakup in some of that mainstream far right. Whether she's, I mean, I think she does. She's this sort of Christian nationalist that I think is, anti-Jewish, but much less overtly than Nick Fuentes is. But so yeah, I mean, I think that it's a tactical move at some level. I mean, Marine Le Pen, I don't follow French politics that closely, and I certainly don't know the Front National's like history that well or whatever. But like Marie Le Pen, right? That her dad is Marie, yeah,
right.
And he was like I think he was pretty I don't know how openly, but fairly openly anti-Jewish. I know one quote I saw him was about like it was the Holocaust was just a footnote of history, right? So the destruction of European Jewry is a footnote of history, and that's like obviously a very insensitive a thing to say. And so but they're, you know, like they're packaging. I mean, if you look at like Orban in Hungary, he's like Netanyahu's like best buddy, right? And so there's this packaging. There is also there was it that Spencer, he was that far right activist, was kind of like quite on the scene in 2019. Is it Spencer? He was like somewhere like in Idaho or whatever. I think there was, you know, some of the Antifa people were like, you know, they punched him, and he was all part of that whole punch Nazi whatever kind of stuff. And he got this, like, he got this rabbi, this pro-Israel rabbi. He caught him where he was like, yeah, Israel's my model. Israel is like an ethno state, and we just want an ethno state for like white Christians. And there was this debate, or it was like a question period at some event, and he just totally got this like like the guy didn't know how to respond to him, you know, kind of saying so. So there is also a current of far right that gets into like Israel as a model of an ethno state, a supremacist state that they like. I think most of it gets down into just sort of like, yeah, what you said is that it's a tactical alliance that's based around being anti-Arab, anti-Muslim, and so you know, that's the sort of the coming together. But I think it's what is really clear to me, and you see this play out on Twitter, I think, in the most clear way, is that how much of the sort of Jewish pro-Israel crowd has really moved towards the echoing of the, like, you know, Maxime Bernier, the anti-immigrant, they like, because of the left has been, you know, challenging what Israel's doing. They have seen, they, first of all, they get alienated from the left and into some degree of a more liberal kind of milieus, but then also they see as their way of demonizing the protests against Israel's onslaught is to say, oh, they're just all a bunch of, you know, Arabs and Muslims that are taking over our country and this and that. And they did that at the, I don't know where I was cut off, and I was going to talk about this last week. I don't know where I was cut off in the in my thing, but the walk for Israel on June 9th in Toronto, that apparently brought out tens and tens of thousands of people. They that van, I don't know, there was a big kerfuffle made about the Rebel News ultimately was running the advertising van. That advertising van, there was a kerfuffle made about it being Islamophobic, and they show, like, you know, people praying, and then they're saying, is this in Iraq? Is this in Syria? Is this in, I don't know, Lebanon, something? And then, no, this is Toronto, and they're basically, wake up Canada, they're taking over, right? The Arabs and Muslims are taking over. That van begins at the Walk for Israel, and it begins with a group that calls itself something like the Concerned Coalition Against Hate and Taking Over Our Campuses. So clearly the language of, like, you know, we're combating the Palestine solidarity. And there was no kerfuffle made about the van when it was at the Walk for Israel. And I think that's not a coincidence, because there's a real desire not to focus in on Islamophobia or anti-Muslim or anti-Arab like racism in Canada, that being instigated by pro-Israel Jewish organizations and individuals. That gets into more murky kind of territory. But it's easier from a sort of liberal perspective, just like condemn that racism or that Islamophobia, but you don't connect it at all to Israel or the organized pro-Israel Jewish organizations. But yeah, I mean, I think that you see this sort of dynamic going on, where I think that clearly what we're seeing here with the Jewish community in Canada is going to be overwhelmingly going to support Pierre Poilievre. That's pushing this, that, you know, partly comes out of this, you know, move towards right and, you know, far rightish kind of milieu. How long that coalition stays together, I don't know.
Can I just ask one quick last question, as we have to go, but there are no other questions? Is with respect to Ukraine and the Canadian government's now wanting to put this pressure on Ukrainians who come to Canada after the start of this war. to get them to go back and fight, which seems so completely vile to me, because go back to be killed or be injured for something you don't want to do. But I'm just wondering, like in Canada, do you think the Canadian population at large, and even the Ukrainian groups in Canada, the organizations, I find it rather hard to believe that no matter how pro-Ukraine they are in this war, that they could be for Ukrainians who don't want to fight being sent back to a very likely death.
Very interesting question. I'm curious to now I'm curious to look at, has the Ukrainian Canadian Congress come out with a position on this? I think that is a very interesting question, because that does put, you know, are we a NATO proxy entity, or are we about Ukrainians? This issue would put it, Ukrainian Canadians for that matter. This issue would put that even I think that, you know, it's a bigger contradiction generally in their politics, but this issue would really put a you know, stake in that dynamic. But I don't know.
Okay, well, I think we can go now because it's almost 7:30. Thanks so much, Eve. That was a great session. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye,
Take
all.
care. See ya.
Bye.